So as you can see, we've assembled around, well, I have assembled around me a host of people who have experience advising clients and doing deals in the Turkish market. If you were here this morning, I gave sort of my pitch for why I think that Turkey is an interesting market to look at. Maybe I can come to you first of all. If you think back at the work that you've done for some of your clients, why did they choose Turkey as opposed to any other of the emerging growing markets that we see around the world at the moment? What sort of brings them to Turkey?
Maybe if we have to give two specific examples for that, I think about the GDP growth in Turkey first. Okay. Because the researchers reveal that the GDP growth rate between 2015 and 2020 is expected to be 4.5% in Turkey, while it is globally around 3.0%. So, which is an attractive prospect for the foreign investors to come to Turkey. And additionally, if we think about the legislation in Turkey, we all know that the investment legislation in Turkey provides equal treatment provisions and equal treatment principles both to local and foreign investors. So if we think these both points, GDP growth and equal treatment principles, I think these are good drivers for the foreign investors to invest in Turkey.
Okay. What about things like favourable demographics? I mean, Tolga, maybe I can come to you. This is one thing that seems to be brought off whenever you're talking about markets such as Turkey, when you're talking about India, for example, to a certain degree, China, that much is made of the favourable demographics. And I'm talking there twofold about, on the one hand, the emerging and growing middle class, but then also the age of the population, that you're having a large number of people moving into that sort of area, that area of the population where you actually have spending power. How much do you think, well, first of all, do you agree with me that those are things that would attract people into Turkey as well, or is that just something that in certain markets is favourable and others not so much, but Turkey is just one of them where it is a bit more favourable than in others?
I mean, first of all, I fully agree with you. And to be honest, it really, I don't know, I feel bored because when people start to discuss about Turkey, these are the first, statements, demography, etc., the financial performance. And I don't care that much, to be honest. I mean, I feel that Turkey is one of those countries, it is worth, to get a bit more attention. And beside these factors, I believe that the Turkish mentality is very entrepreneurial. Instead of evaluating things with numbers, Turkey, in terms of intercultural effects, is really complex, and this is why I've enjoyed the last panel a lot. I mean, I don't know if it was Kadri or Eren or even Alexander. They mentioned that the Germans and the Turks are getting closer and closer each day. So the fact, with my Turkish background, that I'm representing the German Investment Corporation, I mean, is in a way evidence for that. But beside that, to be honest, I feel that Turkey is having a huge potential, still immature, intransparent, complex, and the more it is like this, the more appetite we are having.
Is it what makes doing deals fun here? That it's not quite as plain sailing, not quite as smooth as it is in other markets?
It is really, I mean, even when you are having a Turkish background, doing deals in Turkey is having its own flavor. It is really not predictable, but it is getting really, in a very substantial way, more and more professional. And this is what we, to be honest, enjoy a lot. And we are really curious and very optimistic for the future.
So you said things like demographics, you find that a little bit boring.
Exactly.
What is the part that makes you excited about Turkey?
Exactly, I mean, demography, that's really lovely to observe from a distance, but when you are making or initiating investments, you obviously go deeper. The entrepreneurial effect, the quality of the management, typical characteristics of the sectors. I mean, we in Germany, we are not that young like the Turkish population, but this does not lead to any melancholy, right? And older people are also investing. So in terms of geographies and demographies, I feel that Turkey is offering a lot, but it is worth much more than this demography, young population issue. And I'm really getting tired of listening to that or reading to that stuff in the news on a regular basis.
But you bring up a really interesting point in relation to the quality of management. It's something that we spoke about in the private equity panel. Sulia, maybe I can come to you. I mean, how much of a challenge, and we will talk about challenges specifically, but does the quality of management, the skill set that you find in the market, is that something that is of any sort of concern? Does that have an impact on your investment decision? Or are you able to look at the asset in relative isolation and really evaluate it on its fundamental qualities?
Okay. Well, actually, among the 36 countries that EBRD is active, when we compare Turkey with all the other countries, I should say that Turkey is one of the countries with the highest education level, with the university educations, PhDs, master degrees, and actually we have a very good management population, I should say, which is serving very well to the market at the moment. This is giving, of course, a lot of comfort, and this also brings together with it a very good entrepreneur mindset. One of the things which we are amazed about Turkey, how people, especially those who had their educations even outside Turkey, but they go back to their hometowns and they try to do something in their hometowns, and they don't try to stick with either the country that they go or in Istanbul or big cities. And then, they always, those mindsets who had the good education but who has the entrepreneur spirit, we have seen becoming really successful cases. I want to give you one example too, for example, which we did equity investment at the beginning of this year. This was BRN from Kayseri. When you look at it, it is one woman who had a good education, who went to Kayseri, her hometown, and started this business from scratch, and now doing very good export levels. So it was a very good case, which is showing what the potential of this country when it comes to equity markets and M&A world.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about the challenges. Tolga, I'd like to come back to you. You spoke about sort of the levels of sophistication that you see in the market. How much of a challenge has it been to access certain types of information, to get people to negotiate with you? What are the challenges that you're facing when you're looking at Turkey?
I mean, we are invested in GPs. We are doing co-investments with them. We are doing direct deals. So I feel in terms of, and also probably being of Turkish background is also making things a bit easier for ourselves. So that's not that tricky. And we are also having a rep office for more than a decade. So in terms of access to deals, that really works, and it's not that challenging. And it is also quite transparent for those who are in the market. So from that end, Catherine, I really feel that it is not that intransparent as it looks from the distance.
Okay. Doyu, I know that you have some experience at dealing with particularly family-owned businesses and sort of how they get involved in an M&A process. I mean, there is obviously, if you have a family-owned business and you bring private equity in, there is obviously the perception that they have about what private equity may or may not do to the company. That's certainly, I'm pretty certain, a challenge that you'll be facing in Turkey, as you face in pretty much every market where you have strong family-owned businesses, companies that have been built up over generations, huge emotional attachment to it. But also, if we're dealing with a trade player coming in to make an acquisition from a family-owned business, they will be running into difficulties. Can you share some of your experiences in that field with us?
I think this is one of the challenges commonly encountered by PEs and other investors in Turkey, in the Turkish market, because the family-owned businesses are very usual in Turkey, still very usual in Turkey, and as we know, almost all target companies in Turkey are established, owned and run by families, and the executives of the family-run businesses, so these companies, are still family members. What is the problem here? So if we think about first about that, there are of course advantages, but if we come to the challenges, so in family-owned businesses, there is a generally lack of professional management, and these companies are governed without having corporate governance rules, and so absence of professional environment in the target brings some additional hurdles together. What are these? For example, I can think about the related party transactions. These kind of target companies have related party transactions which may not be concluded on arm's length basis. We can think about also lack of proper bookkeeping, and also which comes together with gross tax implications and also conflict compliance issues. So these are the challenges which are shown in the family-owned businesses. So considering that most of the foreign investors running their business in their home countries at a certain level of professionalism, when they come to Turkey and see this environment, then it is very difficult for them to understand these issues, as we have discussed in the previous session. It is very difficult for them to understand these challenges and to adapt themselves to the environment in the Turkish target companies. So they live kind of a culture shock while they are trying to understand this. And we always say negotiations are very good, very useful tools to understand the general approach of the counterparties to specific issues, and also the general mindset of the parties. So, however, during the negotiations, while the investor tries to tries to explain the deficiencies in the target companies, and while they are attempting to recover them, sometimes the promoters in the Turkish companies can receive these with kind of suspicion, and then this makes the tension in the negotiations higher.
Okay.
So this is one of the challenges, I think.
You raise a really interesting point in relation to corporate governance, because I think corporate governance is one of those things that has become a really hot topic in some of the more established M&A markets. It's all about corporate governance, but people tend to forget that obviously the corporate governance rules that we see in the Anglo-Saxon market and some of the more established markets in Europe, they didn't just appear overnight. They're the result of lengthy development within an organization. Sule, you as an organization invest in lots of different markets. So how do you feel that because you have experience in working in different markets, you're able to overcome the challenges posed by, say, a lack of a structured corporate governance framework more easily than, say, a trade player who has only limited experience in dealing with certain markets without that corporate governance framework?
Actually, you touch upon a very important point, and yes, corporate governance is one of the biggest challenges any market which we are operating at the moment. However, it's a kind of precondition also for our equity investments. Whenever we start talking with any kind of potential investee company, the first thing we tell them, okay, I mean, whatever the commercial terms is, okay, one thing, but we want to make sure that we make a due diligence of your corporate governance rules, policies, and understand what are the gaps there, and then come up with a kind of corporate governance action plan. And this corporate governance action plan becomes an annex of our shareholder agreement, and there are some to-dos with the certain deadlines put on this action plan that the company has to achieve, so that at the end, as you know, we are not a long-term investor, but we are more like a private equity or institutional investor that we stay for certain horizon, and at the end, once we see the exit, right time for the exit, we exit. And when we are exiting, we want to make sure that the company has a good setup for the corporate governance policies, that after our exit, it can continue and act in the best manner from the corporate governance point of view. This is a kind of precondition for all our investments. And I just want to also add one more thing to the challenges for the equity investments in Turkey. As you may know, IFRS is not a must for this country. We have a Turkish gap for the accounting standards. And especially, I mean, big companies, large companies are doing the IFRS in addition to the Turkish gap, but when it comes to especially medium and small size companies, you don't really see the IFRS. And this makes the foreign investors to evaluate the financial standing of the company for their investment very difficult. Another requirement that we always put as a condition in order to improve the reporting processes of the companies, we always request that the company has to start doing IFRS so that the company financials and information and financial standing can be seen more transparently. A third area which I want to also mention, unfortunately still 50% of this country, bless you,
thank you,
unregistered. And this comes from the past practice of high tax policies of the government and still this unregistered economy is also a kind of burden for any kind of equity transaction that we want to do. And sometimes we are not able to see exactly, when you look at the financials, you cannot really see what the real business of the company sometimes. This is even more true when you go to the Anatolia, especially the southern Anatolia or eastern Anatolia, that there is a huge unregistered economy, which is, if you ask me, is causing also some kind of challenge for this.
Okay, I think we spent a fair bit of time talking about the challenges. People still see Turkey as a huge opportunity. There are lots of possibilities out there for companies to invest in. So how do they manage to overcome these challenges? Duru, maybe this is the point where you come in and tell us about the fantastic work that advisors do in this particular context. I mean, I think we've established that there is a great need to work with local advisors to have a good understanding of the market. Can you talk us through some of the practicalities and practical advice that you are able to offer your clients to make sure that once they've identified the opportunity, once they've identified the challenges don't get in the way?
Actually, if we come to the local advisor point, we can ask the question why it is crucial to have a local advisor. At that point, I would link my words to my words I made previously, because when the tension goes higher, I think the role of the local advisors becomes more important because the most important role of the local advisor is to interpret both parties' requests and expectations to the others. We see during the negotiations, usually in Turkey, that there's a language barrier between the parties. For example, the local promoters are not generally capable of understanding the deal components, complicated deal components, and negotiating them directly with the counterparty, with the foreign investors. At that point, the local advisor should be able to bring these both parties to the same platform and to clarify the issues between them, and also act as if he or she is a bridge between the parties, and they can he or she should be able to ensure that both parties speak the same language, but not only linguistic, both technically and also culturally. So I think this is the most important area of the work of scope of local advisors.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Tolga and Sule, maybe you can share a little bit with us some practical experience, challenge that you've encountered, but most importantly, how did you get around them? Are there situations where you've looked at a company and said, you know what, while the opportunity is certainly interesting, we just see difficulties here that we can't overcome? Is there ever a moment to walk away? Tolga, maybe I can come to you first with that one.
I mean, in Turkey, there is a lovely proverb, fazla nas aşı usandırır. I mean, when you are having negotiations, and obviously there is it is tricky, and everyone is defending their position, etc. So very recently we had a situation where everyone fell in love to the investment, but unfortunately after a certain point we decided to cancel our efforts.
What made you fall in love with it though?
What I mentioned, I mean, in terms previously, being entrepreneurial was really important, at least to me, to observe that the people are, even when there are deficits, I mean, when there are, I don't know, brave hearts, and when they are really in the mood to get the things done, invest additional efforts, being clever. And by the way, the definition of clever is a different one, as I would say, what we discussed previously with this, in Turkey, just to give an example, being clever is probably quite close to the definition we are having in Germany, and compared to China, being clever is something what we would call fraud, right? So,
and we're not intending to offend any Chinese in the room.
And it's the same to corporate governance issues, and this is what I also shared, you know, to some friends of mine who were complaining about corporate governance in Turkey, and I simply feel that Turkey, in these terms, is running to a right direction. It is still an immature market, and this is not meant as a critique, but I'm inviting everyone, by comparing this kind of things, also to have a look around China, for instance. Right? So, to sum it up, being entrepreneurial, having what it takes to go the extra mile, this was really something we liked a lot. But after a certain stage, if you feel that, you know, if your partner is probably not really in the mood of being that solution oriented, right? We are not in the mood to stay and defend negotiations, you know, that long, and are quite honest and direct by quitting this kind of negotiations. And this is probably something that is a big deficit in Turkey. Valuations.
You make two really interesting points. When I asked you about what made you fall in love with the company, you gave a number of factors that I can completely follow, but I would imagine are very difficult to actually quantify and put on paper. I mean, saying that a company has a fantastic entrepreneurial spirit is something that makes it really, really interesting. If you want to value that, that's actually quite tricky, and I would imagine that when you're trying to then sell this to your investors, why we're going to put money behind that company, that must be quite tricky.
You know, it's not that tricky. I mean, we are investing our own monies, we are investing German money, so we are really conservative, right? And obviously we are having a very passionate risk department, but what I mean with entrepreneurial, when you are really having this quality, at the end of the day, obviously this leads to the right financials. So being a fantastic entrepreneur, at the end of the day, I mean, our understanding at least, is not leading to deficits in the majority of cases. So you really have to get along with these things, be solution oriented, find solutions, use your network in order to get the things done. But this is really something we consider as very important, beside this typical analysis, etc.
Okay, thank you very much for that really interesting insight. Sule, maybe I can pick your brains on this question of the challenges that you faced, how you overcame them, and if there were situations where you walked away.
Well, I should say in most of the cases why we walked away was valuation.
Yeah.
And because most of the Turkish companies, of course, they are all brilliant, and they all have some strengths, and that's why we start seeing the potential, we start talking to them. However, when it comes to valuations, I mean, sometimes there are expectations which are at such level that it is impossible to justify. Because of that, because we are actually IFI, in some cases, if possible in most cases, we therefore, in order not to stuck with the valuation issue, we try to have a co-investor aside us from the private sector, so that the private sector co-investor makes the valuation, and then we simply use our right to match in a way, or we simply match the price that it is determined. However, what we are observing is also, even in the case of private investors, they are also sometimes having big difficulty to justify the valuation that the selling party is requesting, and I'm seeing that in most of the cases why the whole deal fall away is maybe there is a kind of, say, I don't know, I'm just making a small difference, but no one wants to get closer to each other, and at the end it falls away. Another thing which we are experiencing is, as you know, because we are minority investors in the investments that we are making, and I'm sure all the private equity firms are also experiencing this. We need some veto rights in order to protect our minority position, and we also need one board seat to make sure that the business plans and the what we agreed with the client is actually becomes reality. Some of those veto rights may be disturbing for the owners, because how they look at it is, of course, they say, I'm the owner of the company, I am the majority shareholder, why should I give you such veto right which you may spoil the whole thing? So that's why, I mean, the companies, how to say, eagerness or readiness towards understanding the minority shareholder position, that if something happens, they need to protect their minority right, becomes very important. And in some of the cases, especially this is even more true when it comes to family-owned companies, because they are so much proud of their company. They are saying, why should I give such veto rights, which is going to spoil all my ownership or control over the company? So those are generally, I'm seeing as the reasons for the walk away. Although the company is really good, it has a very good potential to invest.
I think this is an education issue, and how they are educated by their lawyers, by their legal advisors about these minority rights, and how they should be protecting them, or how they should be reacting against these minority rights issue. So this comes again to the point where that the local advisors are very important, I think.
Great, thank you very much, Tolga. You wanted to pitch in there as well.
Simply one more point. I believe beside education, and that's really a very important issue, it is really of significant importance in Turkey when you are having negotiations to address your points in a way that it is face-saving for everyone. So in Turkey, I mean, we in Europe, we are probably a bit more aggressive at the end of the day, or the people are in a way reacting in a different way to some scenarios. But in Turkey, face-saving, addressing your issues, your points, in a face-saving way is really something that needs to be addressed, and managing this intercultural stuff is really quite important, and in a way underestimated, I feel, the past years at least.
Okay, that's a fantastic point. I'd love to come back to that, and hopefully by the end of the conversation we will. I do, however, want to, because it's mentioned on the agenda, want to spend some time talking about the valuation gap. I was delighted to hear from Sule about that, because that is something that, in my opening remarks, I made the point that there is always going to be a valuation gap in an M&A process. If I want to sell something, I naturally want to get more money for it than you would be willing to pay for it, because you obviously want to pay as low a price as you possibly can. However, over the last couple of years, I feel that there has been the emergence of a valuation gap that we saw, similar to what we saw before the financial crisis, a real dislocation between the valuation that a seller and a buyer put on a particular asset that has comparatively little to do with the underlying fundamentals of that business. Sule, it sounds like you've definitely experienced that. Tolga, can you tell us, is that something that you've come across as well? And how do you negotiate your way out of it? Or do you, at the beginning of an investment process, say, this is the line and we will not cross it?
I mean, what I have observed is when you are frank from the beginning, I mean, on the first hand, it is really education. As I mentioned before, Turkey is still an immature market, but it is converting to a higher level of maturity, and this is wherever you look, I mean, the same in countries, I mean, similar with Turkey's maturity level. But beside that, I feel that, within, let's say, a typical frame, when you are frank, when you try to explain things, it leads in the majority of cases to, let's say, transparency and trust. This is obviously not always leading to a happy ending, right? But we feel that from our point of view, the only thing what we can do is to explain things in more detail, to create this level of trust. And at the end of the day, when we feel it is not adequate, we are simply, canceling the negotiations. So that easy, right? I don't know if it is. I mean, this valuation gap is not something that is, in an exclusive way typical for Turkey. In the markets where we are operating, we are having these issues on a regular basis. But at least this is a way how we are trying to handle this stuff.
Okay, thank you very much. You raised the issue of trust. For you, I would like to bring you in at that stage. Obviously, the relationship of trust is key in the relationship between the legal advisor and the corporate. I know that you don't necessarily get involved in the price negotiations, but can you share a little bit with us the experience that you've had when it comes to pricing and how much of an impact it might have on the work that you do later on in a transaction?
Pricing, actually, this is the financial side of the M&A businesses. So more specifically, the corporate advisors and the financial advisors are getting involved to the pricing discussions between the parties. However, this is a kind of trust issue, and while agreeing on the pricing, because this is the most important part of the deal for the local promoters, especially local sellers, so they want to ask the opinion to the local advisors as well. So in our previous session, Eren said, or as far as I remember, it was Eren or Kadri Bey, I'm not sure about it. It is important to hold the hand of the client and say, yes, it is okay, you can move forward. So at that point, they are coming back to us, and based on our past experiences, they want to have a positive answer from our side. So it's more a trust issue, and we are trying to be helpful to them during these price negotiations based on our past experiences, and because we know the company during our due diligences, vendor due diligences, we give our opinion and try to be useful for them.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'd like to spend a few minutes time talking about strategic objectives and whether, if you look back on deals, they've been fulfilled. After that, I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you have anything that you'd like to ask the panel, hold it on for a second or so, and then we'll come back to you. So the issue of strategic objectives, we were talking earlier on, we started the conversation with a look at what are companies actually trying to achieve when doing a deal in Turkey? Why do they come to Turkey and doing the deals? And I've often found that the aspirations, I guess, that you have for a deal, for a piece of strategy that you're executing at the beginning, are often slightly different to what you end up with. Not better or worse, just slightly different. Sule, maybe you can share with us, if you look back on the deals that you've done, and you think of the expectations that you had of it when you executed them, and you see where you are at now, do you feel that your objectives were fulfilled?
Well, okay. I mean, we are, of course, IFI, and I cannot really compare ourselves probably with a commercial investor or typical private investor. And why we are doing all this is to support those good potential companies to grow. And unfortunately in Turkey, one of the biggest issues is when it comes to growing or the growth of the companies. Most of the cases, the companies try to finance their growth with the short-term financing, which is not a healthy structure as well. And what we are trying to do, especially for those companies who has a good potential, we say, okay, we are here, we are happy to inject equity for you. Don't get into this kind of risky ways of growing with the short-term financing, and we will help you. And unfortunately in Turkey, although it appears as it is one of the most developed countries, capital markets are not really very well developed. And I mean, just look at last year, how many IPOs done, that even shows you how, and also when it comes to other equity financing tools, like bond issues, and so there is still a very limited market, unfortunately. And that's why our biggest objective or strategic objective is to support them by bringing equity. Of course, in the long run, we want to make sure that those companies go for IPO, they become a listed company. they become one of those public companies who's performing transparently with the best corporate governance rules. And some of the cases, what happens is because the capital markets are not there, we cannot do the IPO. And then we need to find other way of exit. And of course, tag along, drag along, rice and all is there. But most of the cases, of course, the company doesn't want to bring another strategic investor, or they don't want to sell their shares. And they say, okay, I'm buying your shares back.
Yeah.
And whether we achieve at the end goal of making the company public listed in the stock exchange to help for the development of the capital markets, unfortunately we are still not there, and hoping to have this, because it is one of the five important missions of EBRD in Turkey. I'm hoping next time when we talk, we will say, yes, we got it.
Great, thank you very much. That's obviously a very specific sort of list of objectives that you have for EBRD. Tolga, what about you guys?
I mean, we are investing in Turkey for, I believe, as DEG more than 2 decades. And as mentioned before, from our point of view, same with Julia, we are having also our focus on impact, social impacts, etc. And just to give you an example, we are investing in the GP environment in order to see them grow. We did the first investment in Turkven, and look where Turkven is today. For a couple of months before, we were very proud and happy to invest in Taksim. So really curious about what Taksim will do in the foreseeable future. So this is also something very important for ourselves. Not, as you mentioned, this capitalistic view on things, or not the pure focus on this kind of things, also social impacts. And I believe Turkven and Taksim, for instance, are really good examples. And we are very keen on Turkey. We believe in the market. Turkey is one of our backbones, and we will hopefully increase in a very significant way the amounts of monies in Turkey in the short term.
Since we have 2 more minutes left, I do want to really quickly touch on cultural issues, because it's one of those things that is always cast aside as the sort of like the fluffy part of an M&A process, and I'm sure it'll be fine, but actually there are huge challenges associated to cultural differences between a buyer and a seller. Keeping in mind the issue of coming into Turkey and doing deals here, Tolga, you said negotiating in a way that saves everybody's face. What else would you think are things for people to keep in mind when dealing with a company in Turkey?
I mean, I would highly recommend everyone who is interested in doing deals in Turkey to spend some additional time to get a better understanding of the Turkish mentality. I mean, when you are investing in China, for instance, the people are more educated, are in a better way probably coached. Also for daily business issues, they're really prepared, and that would be from my point of view a recommendation. Besides, Turkey is really professional. There are some probably minor things when you take them into account that could affect the whole processing in a very positive way. And Turkey is really worth investing some more time and attention on this kinds of intercultural things, I would say.
Thank you very much. Sule, what about you?
Well, actually, maybe one of the key things, as also Tolga said, I think that it's really important that a foreign investor coming to Turkey and trying to do a business, I think they need to really understand and get a better feel of what the Turkish culture is, because we are Mediterranean and we are very emotional people. Yeah. And this also becomes even more true when it comes to business, because the companies, the owners of the companies are believe in their companies like blood in their veins. Anything which you tell them a little bit differently, they can feel insulted. So I mean, we should not forget that Turkish people sometimes make their decisions with their emotions rather than with their rational. So we need to keep this in mind, I think, when we are doing business here.
Great, thank you. So maybe a couple of closing words from your side.
Yes, I agree with both of our guests, and I want to mention again that the human relationships are very essential in Turkey to navigate also in the Turkey's business life. Yeah. So at that point, we mentioned that the local advisors are important, but I think if they have concerns to adapt, if the foreign investors have concerns to adapt themselves to the Turkish culture and to the difficulties, in that case, a co-local partner, Turkish co-local partner, may be helpful them to navigate them in Turkey through legislations, unspoken protocols, and other things, and so their investments can be more successful at the end of the investment period. This is my thought.
Great, thank you very much. Now, are there any questions right at the end? If not, I would like to say thank you very much for this closing panel. I felt it was really, really interesting to get a sense for how you go about doing deals, some of the challenges that you encountered, more importantly, how you can overcome them and things to keep in mind. I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you for sticking around until the end. I hope you've enjoyed the day. I'd like to round off by saying thank you very much to our sponsors, Baker McKenzie and Merrill DataSite, who have supported this event for so many years. Please join us outside for a drink, and I look forward to seeing you again next year. Thank you very much.